Blessed are the thankful, for they are never poor in joy. Today we reflect on a simple but life-changing truth found throughout the teachings of Jesus. A grateful heart opens the door to lasting happiness. In a world that constantly urges us to want more, achieve more, and compare ourselves endlessly, Jesus gently invites us to pause, look around, and recognize the goodness of God already present in our daily lives. Jesus never taught that joy comes from abundance or comfort. In fact, many of his teachings point in the opposite direction. He spoke to the poor, the weary, the overlooked, and the broken, and yet he called them blessed. This blessing was not rooted in what they possessed, but in how they saw the world and trusted God within it. Gratitude, according to Jesus, is not a reaction to perfect circumstances. It is a way of seeing life through the lens of faith. Think about how often we delay happiness, telling ourselves we will be grateful once something changes, once life becomes easier, once prayers are answered exactly the way we want, once struggles disappear. But Jesus never said, "Be thankful when everything goes right." Instead, he showed gratitude in ordinary moments, in scarcity, and even in suffering. He gave thanks before breaking bread that he knew would not seem enough. And somehow, gratitude made room for abundance. When Jesus fed the multitudes, he did not begin with complaints about how little there was. He did not panic over the size of the crowd or the limits of human provision. He simply took the loaves, lifted his eyes to heaven, and gave thanks. That moment teaches us something profound. Gratitude invites God into our lack. When we thank God for what we have, we acknowledge that he is present and at work even before we see the outcome. Many of us struggle with joy because our attention is fixed on what is missing. We measure our lives by what we lack rather than what we've been given. Jesus teaches us to reverse that focus. He tells us to look at the birds of the air who do not store away food, yet are cared for by God. He points to the flowers of the field, clothed in beauty without striving. These examples are not just about provision, they are invitations to gratitude. They remind us that God is attentive to details we often overlook. Gratitude changes the posture of the heart. When we are thankful, we stop clenching our fists around fear and begin opening our hands in trust. Jesus repeatedly calls his followers to this kind of trust. Do not worry about tomorrow, he says, not because tomorrow doesn't matter, but because worry blinds us to today's blessings. Gratitude anchors us in the present moment, where God's grace is already active. Jesus also understood that gratitude has the power to heal relationships and restore perspective. When he healed 10 lepers, only one returned to give thanks. Jesus noticed, not because he needed praise, but because gratitude revealed something deeper about that man's heart. Gratitude showed awareness, it showed humility, it showed recognition of God's mercy. The healing of the body was a miracle, but the grateful response revealed a healing of the soul. How often do we receive God's gifts and rush on without acknowledging the giver? Life moves quickly, and blessings can become so familiar that we stop noticing them. Breath, strength, a kind word, another day to begin again. Jesus teaches us to slow down enough to recognize grace in ordinary moments. Gratitude trains our eyes to see what God is doing quietly and faithfully every day. A thankful heart also guards us against bitterness. Jesus warned about storing up treasures on earth, not because possessions are evil, but because attachment breeds anxiety and disappointment. Gratitude loosens that grip. When we are thankful, we stop demanding that life meet our expectations and instead receive life as a gift. This shift brings peace, because peace does not come from control, it comes from surrender. Jesus lived a life of deep gratitude, even knowing suffering lay ahead. At the Last Supper, on the night before his betrayal, he gave thanks. That moment is staggering when we truly think about it. Surrounded by uncertainty and pain, Jesus still chose gratitude. This teaches us that gratitude is not denial of hardship, it is faith in the goodness of God despite hardship. Gratitude does not ignore pain, it places pain in God's hands. Living gratefully does not mean pretending everything is fine. Jesus himself wept,
felt sorrow, and experienced anguish. Yet gratitude remained part of his relationship with the Father. He trusted that God was present in joy and sorrow alike. When we learn to give thanks in all seasons, we discover a deeper joy that circumstances cannot steal. Gratitude also shapes how we treat others. Jesus taught that love of God and love of neighbor are inseparable. A grateful heart naturally becomes a generous heart. When we recognize how much we've been given, we become more patient, more compassionate, and more forgiving. Gratitude softens our judgments and expands our empathy. It reminds us that everything we have is, ultimately, grace. Many people chase happiness as if it were something to be acquired. Jesus shows us that happiness, or blessedness, flows from being rightly oriented towards God. Gratitude aligns our hearts with God's truth. It reminds us that life itself is a gift, not a transaction. We don't earn grace, we receive it, and gratitude is our response to that gift. Jesus also teaches us that gratitude fuels contentment. Whoever has will be given more, he says, not as a promise of material gain, but as a spiritual principle. When we appreciate what we have, our capacity for joy increases. When we constantly focus on what we lack, joy shrinks. Gratitude enlarges the soul. It creates room for wonder, peace, and hope. A living, grateful life does not require dramatic change. It begins with small, intentional choices. Thanking God at the start of the day, acknowledging His presence in routine moments, offering thanks not only for answered prayers, but for strength to endure unanswered ones. Jesus teaches us that faithfulness in small things matters. Gratitude in small things matters too. Even suffering can become a place where gratitude grows, not because suffering is good, but because God is faithful. Jesus never promised a life without trouble. He promised His presence within it. Gratitude helps us recognize that presence. It reminds us that we are not alone, that God walks with us, and that even broken paths can lead to deeper trust. When we live gratefully, joy stops being fragile. It no longer depends on perfect conditions. It becomes rooted in relationship with God. This is the joy Jesus offers, a joy that remains steady through change, a joy grounded in gratitude, trust, and love. Today, Jesus invites us to look again at our lives, not with the eyes of comparison or complaint, but with the eyes of faith, to notice God's daily gifts, both large and small, to thank Him not just for what we hope He will do, but for what He is already doing. When we choose gratitude, we choose joy, and in that choice, we discover the quiet blessing Jesus promised all along, a heart at rest in God's goodness.